Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis here. This week in American History Part 1, we're going to be looking at the sectional crisis and the beginnings of the American Civil War. We're particularly going to be looking at the crisis as it develops in the 1850s, particularly as it was associated following, for example, the Compromise of 1850 over the entry of California into the United States as a free state, the crisis surrounding the development of things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which of course was done largely over intents over building a transcontinental railroad. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act that kind of created this notion that the territory of Kansas and Nebraska would be divided in the South Kansas and in the North Nebraska, and both states would be allowed to decide whether or not they would be free states or slave state. And this was this issue of popular sovereignty that was advocated by figures like the Democrat Stephen Douglas. Popular sovereignty was the idea that states should be allowed to choose whether or not they're going to be a slave state or a free state. And of course, with Kansas, Nebraska, the idea was that Kansas was in the South and would maybe more naturally become a slave state. And Nebraska in the North, in the Midwest, would become a free state. But of course, as you'll see in this week's lesson, this doesn't happen. It doesn't play out this way. Free advocates and slave advocates descended onto Kansas, each attempting to sway the new state of Kansas, to either a slave state or a free state. And that's really what the sectional crisis, when we talk about sort of the origin of the American Civil War, the sort of background of this crisis, the so-called sectional crisis, is really centered around this fight in the United States, and particularly playing out in places like the United States Senate, over the presence of free states or slave states. And so slave states had a concern that as free states came to outnumber the amount of slave states, particularly in the United States Senate, that slave states would lose their power to sort of expand or insulate the institution of slavery, which the South had come to believe was integral to its economy. And so as a result of this, every time a new state, as the United States was expanding west, and this went, of course, back to the Missouri Compromise issue of 1819 and 1820, over the entry of Missouri and also likewise the ultimate entry of the state of Maine, the United States had for decades, every time as it was expanding westward, it had for decades been dealing with this issue. Will the new state be a slave state and a free state? And if it would be a free state, would the slave states accept its admission to the Union because of this concern over losing a ability to have a majority voice or an equal voice in particularly the United States Senate? Remember, the United States Senate, every state, regardless of size, gets 2 senators. This was, of course, part and parcel to the compromise that was created in the Constitutional Convention by small states like Connecticut, was that every state would have the same amount of senators, and the House of Representatives and Congress would be based on the population. So we're looking at the sectional crisis this week. Section, right? The divide of the country between sections. The South and the slaveholding section, and the North and the free sort of labor section, more or less. So we're looking at this. We're going to look at the kind of origin and lead up to and the beginnings of the American Civil War. Your assignment, the major assignment this week, there is no discussion forum or anything, and I just wanted to make sure I got in here and added this into this announcement. You have an essay this week. The essay, and please follow the prompt guidelines that are found in our content area this week. But the essay The essay is designed to be a 2-page essay, okay? I want it in Times New Roman font 12. I want it double spaced. And when I say, 2 pages, I don't have a big header, 2 full pages of text written in paragraph form with an introduction, a body section, and a conclusion. And I want you to use your textbook and see the citation example. I want the paper cited with footnotes in I want them in Chicago style format, but you don't have to worry about like learning how to do Chicago style necessarily. Just insert a footnote, and I have a citation example from your textbook, and just use that example in your footnotes. So make sure you cite the page numbers. I want you to use your textbook on this paper, and I want you to respond to one of the 3 broad sort of essay topics that you find in the prompt this week. So our major assignment is an essay. Make sure that you use your textbook and you cite it and you follow the prompt guidelines in the content area for this week. Here's the factoid for this week, and of course, these bonus points also help out at the end of the term. Now, the factoid for this week, and relates to the image behind you, the image that you see here, or behind me, the image that you see here is, of course, the United States Capitol building. And this is in 1861 during the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, the Capitol building at this time, the rotunda that, of course, I'm sure we all know the image of the United States Capitol building today, was under construction at this time. The factoid is this. The factoid relates to the election of 1860. The election of 1860 is one of the strangest elections in American history, one of the most controversial, or divisive, I should say, maybe, elections in American history. It's rivaled only by other elections like the election of 1824, which was the election that saw John Quincy Adams become the President of the United States in an election that Andrew Jackson declared the so-called corrupt bargain. In the election of 1860, there were 4 candidates. This is one of the reasons why, that was the same case, by the way, in 1824, but this is one of the reasons why it's such an interesting election. There were 4 candidates, and of course, it's a hugely consequential election as well. There were 4 candidates. One candidate, obviously, was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party was pretty much a brand new party, and it represented the North, the sort of the free labor section in the United States. Free labor meaning that the Republican Party believed that workers had a right to work in their place of choosing and to earn a wage for this work. Free labor, right? They were anti-slavery. Now, Abraham Lincoln, upon running for the presidency, made it known that he did not intend to abolish slavery in the South, but the Republicans and Abraham Lincoln absolutely opposed the further expansion of slavery. So you had the Republicans with Abraham Lincoln. Well, now is where it gets really interesting. The Democratic Party at the time, and this was the party originally founded by Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Party was a national party. There were Northern Democrats, there were Southern Democrats, there were Democrats in all sections of the United States. Well, the Democratic Party divided itself. They had a convention, and the convention was in Charleston, South Carolina, but the party was divided. There was one faction of the party that followed Stephen Douglas from Illinois, and Stephen Douglas was a critical sort of American sort of politician at the time. And Douglas was an advocate of popular sovereignty. Douglas did not, he wanted to take what at the time would have been a more moderate route on the slave issue by saying, in Douglas's opinion, it's not about the federal government banning slavery or not. Instead, it should be about popular sovereignty in new states. So if states want slavery, then they can vote for it to have it or not. And the reality was most of the West did not cater to large plantation economic farming, and so most individuals like Stephen Douglas knew that that meant ultimately there would be fewer slave states. So you had Stephen Douglas. Well, at this time, the Deep South states, the Southern slave states were intensely sort of, I guess, aggravated by what they saw as this plight that they saw as the ultimate abolishment or abolition of slavery. And the Deep South states walked out of the Charleston Convention, where they were going to nominate, ultimately, the plan was to nominate Stephen Douglas. And the Deep South states demanded that the Democratic Party take on a platform in which they advocated that the federal government should basically have the power and expand slavery in states even where slavery was not desired by the popular will of the people of that state. So anyway, to make the long story short, what ultimately happens is there's another convention. One faction of Northern and Midwestern Democrats, they nominate Stephen Douglas. The Deep South sort of pro-slavery party of the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, they nominate a guy named John C. Breckinridge. And then the sort of mid-Atlantic states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, these states nominated a guy named John Bell as part of the Constitution Party. And the Constitution Party was basically like, let's not just change anything. They were trying to completely avoid the issue of slavery. So what happened, and I'll get to the specific factoid in a second, what happened, of course, the Democrats divided themselves, effectively making the election of Abraham Lincoln more or less a foregone conclusion. Lincoln would carry the North, Breckinridge carried most of the South, Bell carried the mid-Atlantic states that I mentioned, those three states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and Douglas took Missouri. He took one state. The candidate who was actually ideally probably the best Democratic candidate, Douglas, only took one state. And Republican Abraham Lincoln wins the election. Here's the factoid. Abraham Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in any of the Deep South states. But so the factoid is Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in any of the Deep South states. And this really was because at this time there wasn't like a secret ballot where all sort of candidates nominated would appear on a ballot. Instead, the people on ballots were based on the voters within those states that effectively put together the ballots. And so Abraham Lincoln was so unpopular in the slave-holding states, despite the fact that Lincoln had said he did not intend to abolish slavery in the South. He just didn't want slavery to expand. But nonetheless, factoid, Abraham Lincoln was left off the ballot in the slave-holding states in the American South. And he won the election by carrying the northern states. Put that factoid in the extra credit discussion board no later than Wednesday by midnight. Get your maybe 2 bonus points this week because it's a long announcement. And I hope everyone has a great week. And email me if you have any questions.